All good. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's webinar with Alex Cook, who's going to talk about wealth management after the budget. Now, I know that a lot of you may have seen the media, but the budget hasn't been well received by the public, according to some opinion polls in the newspapers today. But what we're going to be looking at is a biblical perspective on wealth, on the budget, and how we as Christians need to look at it. So I'm going to hand over to Alex Cook. Alex is well known. He's a professional financial advisor, and Alex has had many opportunities in Australia to talk to a number of Christian organisations. He was actually at my church as well, not that long ago. So Alex, over to you, and thank you for talking to us about the budget.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Greg. I'll just bring up my screen here as well. So let me share my slides with everyone. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that. Excellent. Let me fix that up. There we go. Excellent. Okay, well, welcome everyone. Thank you for being part of tonight. Hopefully you'll get a lot out of it. As Greg said, I'm keen to chat to you about the budget. What were the implications of it? What's sort of a Christian perspective on it? And then how do we navigate our finances in light of that, particularly what's going on around the world these days, because the world's getting a bit more complicated and a bit more crazy every day. So just a 2-second background for those who don't know me. I know many of you would because you came to the webinar via our email list, but some of you might not. So I lead an organisation called Wealth with Purpose, which we would call a stewardship ministry, basically a teaching ministry about what the Bible says about money. So our passion is really to help people to live with financial health. We want them to get a great understanding of what the Bible says about money, which is exciting because the Bible has a lot to say about the topic. And then for you to become financially healthy as a result of implementing it. So a big part of what we do is trying to make that practical for people so that you can actually implement God's word into your finances. As Greg said, my background's in financial advice. So I've been giving advice since the very late 90s, originally in stockbroking, then in financial planning, and I've been a self-employed financial planner since 2005. Love helping people, love teaching about this kind of thing, and just sharing what the Bible has to say as well. So also, whenever we talk about money, you got to give a disclaimer these days. And really, the point is because we want to have a Q&A at the end, and we want to be able to answer any of your questions. I'm happy to address any questions people have, but we just have to say that this is an educational webinar. It's not to give you personalised financial advice. So just keep that in mind as we go and answer your questions. So a bit of an agenda. I want to talk briefly about biblical stewardship, just what the concept is, and therefore how should we be thinking about money from a Christian point of view. Then I want to talk about the budget. I want to start initially with how I think Christians should think about budgets when they're presented to us. Then I'll talk about the major announcements. I want to focus on here the big things that were announced by Jim Chalmers and how they may affect you. And they'll obviously affect people in different ways. Then I want to talk about, given what we've witnessed over the last 12, 18 months, there's been a dramatic increase in cost of living pressures. So I want to talk about how do we address some of that, and also strategies to get ahead with your finances in general. And then we wrap it up and we'll have a Q&A section at the end. So that's what I want to focus on this evening. So as I say, the important thing is to think biblically about money. What excites me is the fact that Jesus himself spoke so much about money. Roughly 15% of his preaching, 11 out of the 39 parables. And if you actually go between the Old and New Testament, somewhere around 2,350 verses on money, wealth, and possessions between the Old and New Testaments. And, as in many cases, there's hundreds just around helping the poor. There's many around the principles around money, many around the spiritual issues around money, like issues like contentment and things like that. And surprisingly, even lots around topics like investment. I'll be covering some of those tonight when we talk about, some of the reflections after the budget. So there's an enormous amount of wisdom that the Bible brings to the topic of money. And then, of course, the question is, well, how do we implement it? The other thing people forget about money, and I think I wish in the church we taught more about it. I know some people think the church talks about it too much. Some people don't think it talks about it enough. But I think as a general rule, we could talk about this topic a lot more, because ultimately money is a heart condition, and often it reflects how we use it is often a reflection of our character. It's often a reflection of our inner condition, how we feel about money, how we behave with money. Are we stingy with our money? Are we fearful with money? All those sort of things are reflected often of our inner condition. And so money is very, in that sense, matters a lot, because it can have a direct impact on our relationship with God. And ultimately, what we don't want is money to have a negative impact on our relationship with God. We want it to be something that helps us draw closer to Him. And of course, money should be used to glorify God, and I'll chat more about that when I talk more about a definition in a moment of stewardship. But the important thing here is that money is a very important issue that as a Christian, it's something I have to deal with in my life. I've got to make sure that I'm addressing it. The other thing is, I think we often lose sight that from a Christian perspective, all our money is actually God's. If you read Psalm 24, verse 1, it says, "The earth is the Lord's in all its fullness, and those that dwell therein." And there's other passages many of you would have read, like, He owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. There's a whole range of scriptures that really point to the fact that, hey, God created the world. It's actually His world, and we are stewards. We are called to manage the resources that He puts into our hands. In fact, I like the concept, the idea that our possessions are on loan to us. In fact, many of you would have read the parable of the talents, also called the parable of the gold bags. And in fact, in one version of Scripture, it's referred to as the parable of the loaned money. And I love that, because really, when you think about it, our money is really that God gives us is on loan to us. And when we pass away, we've got to hand it all back. So it's a very important way to think about it. The other thing is, this is a spiritual battle. When you think about how money gets used in our society, there is a battle raging on around us. The Bible tells us we're in a spiritual war. And the fact of the matter is that the devil wants to use money against you. He wants to use it as a weapon. Whereas Christians, we should see money as a tool, and particularly as a tool for doing good. So many people get swept up in this battle, and it draws them away from God. When I look at Australian society particularly, I often reflect on there's a passage in Deuteronomy 8:18. It says, "Remember the Lord, for it is He who gives you the ability to gain wealth." And there's a few different versions that say the same thing in a slightly different way. And the point, I think, is that as Australia has got more prosperous, what's happened is we've forgotten the Lord, and that's taking people away from God. And so that's why I say it's very much a spiritual battle. The other thing here is, Greg, I don't know if you know, but there's a bit of background noise there, Greg. Greg, it's a bit of money there. Background. Greg, I don't know if you're aware, there's a bit of background noise there. So the other point to make here about money is often very seductive. It can have a big impact on us. It seduces us into, and the real danger here is that you fall in love with money. Okay, and really, as a believer, and this is the thing that shocks me. I'm 40. Life has gone. Is that life is unbelievably quick, and we want to really direct our money towards eternity. We want to have an eternal focus with our money and really make our lives count and our finances count for things that are of eternal value. And actually, ultimately, we'll be given an account. And the Bible doesn't shrink away from the fact that you will ultimately be rewarded in eternity. How we live our lives here, I want to get to heaven and hear the words, "Well done, good and faithful servant," from Jesus. And as I say, we're ultimately going to have to give an account for how we've used the money that God's put in our hands. So I want to offer you a bit of a definition. As you can see, I've sourced this from another website. I stole it from stewardship.com because I thought they had a fabulous definition for stewardship. And that is that stewardship is managing God's blessings in God's ways and for God's glory. Now, when I think about Australia, I think if we're honest, it is a very blessed nation. Whilst I think we're becoming unanchored from our Christian roots, sadly, and so much of that blessing is slowly dissipating. It is still an enormously blessed nation by most standards around the world. And I think we should be very thankful for that. But then the next issue then becomes, well, are we doing it in God's ways? In other words, are we handling the money that God has given us in God's ways? And then lastly, is it for God's glory? And so what do I mean by that? And the analogy I like to give is, imagine you're driving around at night, and as you know, many churches have a spotlight, and that spotlight is often in the garden, shining up at the cross on top of the roof of the church. And really, that's what our lives should be like, and our money should be doing the same, is it's pointing people to the cross. It's pointing people to Jesus. And that's what I mean when I say we glorify God. We're not getting any of the glory for what we're doing. God is. And so that's how we should, how we're stewarding the money that God has blessed us with. Some of the background there, but let's now jump into the actual budget itself. And I want to give some thinking about, what does a biblical budget look like? Now, if any of you are having trouble hearing me, just let me know, because my headset just made a funny noise. I just want to make sure you can all hear me. So what does a biblical budget look like? In other words, what are the sort of principles behind doing, if I was the treasurer and I was doing a budget, if I, as a Christian, what would I do if I was the one in charge? Well, the way I tend to look at these things, and really any government policy, so not just economic but social policies as well, is, do they enable human flourishing? As Christians, we're called to love others, and if you look at the great commands, what did Jesus himself say? He said, love God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And so when I think we look at government policy, we should say, is this going to benefit our society? Is it going to allow people to be all that they've been called to be? I think that is a really important thing. I also think when it comes to budgets, and I think one of the disappointing things, I think, in the era that we live in, because we live in a very, poll-driven era. In fact, Greg mentioned that at the start, the polls are showing that the budget hasn't necessarily gone down that well. And I think that's the problem with that, is that politicians are very poll-driven. And that means that rather than having a long-term focus on running the country, it's often very short-term. And I think that's disappointing, and I think that's problematic in the sense that they don't make the big calls that need to be made to get the country set up well for the future. And we have had some big calls in the past where you heard, Paul Keating, brought in superannuation back in '92, I think it was. And of course, John Howard, the GST, two big things that have had a big long-term impact on the country. And so we need those kind of big calls. And we do often mean politicians, and I think, this is the challenge, and I don't envy them being in their job, often need to make tough short-term decisions that can bring around short-term pain, but that have long-term benefits. In fact, this is the dilemma the Reserve Bank has at the moment. You think about what's gone on over the last 12 months. You've had interest rates spike, courtesy of the Reserve Bank. And the reason they're doing that is because they've got to choose. Do they slow the economy down dramatically through raising rates, or do they let inflation continue to run out of control? Both are going to have pain, because if you allow inflation to last for any period of time, cost of living goes up and life gets very expensive for people, and that has all sorts of long-term problems. You only have to look at other countries around the seas that have endemic inflation. And then you look at the alternative, which is you jack up rates, which of course has a huge amount of pain on those with mortgages. So, tough decisions that governments have to make. The other thing, and this is more a comment in general, once again, if you look at budgets over the last, I would argue that the past 10, 20 years, the size of government continues to grow. The Australian government gets bigger and bigger every year, and a bigger percentage of our GDP. I think that's very problematic in the long run. Government is expensive, and it also means more less freedom and more costs and more taxes over time as government gets bigger and bigger, and more intervention in our lives. And in fact, I would argue, certainly over my lifetime, that as Australia has become more and more godless, we've become less and less free. There's more and more regulations for everything. You know, because I'm a financial planner, I work with clients that, you know, that all have jobs in different industries, and you can just see it. You know, everyone's jobs are becoming more and more regulated, more and more government intervention. I think that's a great tragedy. And as I say, when you take God out of society, the government steps in and takes that role, and that's much more challenging. And of course, the other big issue that I think in Australia, and this is the thing that I would say angers me, is the cost of housing in Australia is absurd. It's extraordinarily expensive. Neither side of, so this is not a you know, political presentation. I think both the major parties are appalling in the area of housing. They say one thing, we want affordable housing, and they come up with all these policies that just make it more expensive. And that to me is a tragedy. I think I'm very concerned about, particularly at the moment, we've got turbocharged immigration. I think we're going to end up with a society where, I mean, you're seeing rents explode, mortgages explode. It's just going to become a nation of slaves, essentially, where people are paying a huge portion of their amount of their living costs in housing. And I think that's a great tragedy. We'll talk more about that when I talk about the policies that the government's come through. But the important thing from this is to say that doesn't really matter to me which party's in. We've both got the same problem, and that is the government keeps getting bigger and bigger, and therefore more and more expensive. And I see that as a long-term problem for the nation. So let's jump into the actual budget itself. What were some of the major announcements, and what are their implications for all of us? Well, a couple of things. And firstly, you know, I didn't envy Jim Chalmers here. He had some very tough decisions to make, in the sense that, as we know, inflation has rocketed up over the last 12 months. Inflation normally sits around 2 to 3%. And that's what the Reserve Bank target rate is. Over the last 12 months, it's got up over 8%. However, keep in mind that's similar around the world. So you're seeing the same sort of thing in Europe and the US. But inflation is very problematic. As you know, you go to the grocery store, everything's more expensive. You see it in various areas of life. And probably the two big areas, and this is what the budget did aim to address, was big areas of expenditure. So expenses such as your energy costs and your housing costs were what they were targeting. And certainly, you know, the way it was pitched as it was somewhat of a cost of living budget. And so I think they did address that. And you could argue they achieved it in the sense that they did bring in policies that would help. There's no question of that. Do they help in the long run, though? I don't think so, because they don't address the long-term structural changes that are necessary. So yes, they're helping people with energy costs and also with housing, but none of the changes are permanent things. They're not long-term things that will actually benefit people over the long term. They're band-aids is how I would describe them. And so I think in that respect, I think it was quite disappointing. And actually the survey that came out before the budget from Ipsos, they put out a survey and they asked Australians what were their major concerns, and the number one concern for 60% of Aussies was the cost of living. So that's a lot of people where they've prioritised that as their number one concern, and that's, you know, no surprise there. Of course, the other thing that they bragged about was that we've gone into budget surplus for the first time in 15 years. You couldn't get a probably more irrelevant statement. I'd love to see Australia run surpluses in general, you know, build up buffers for the future tough times. But this budget surplus is really an anomaly. It's due to a spike in government revenues. You know, Australia's got the benefit of high commodity prices at the moment, plus there's been an increase in both personal income tax and corporate taxes. And so it's just an anomaly. If you look at the budget's own projections, we go back straight into deficit next year. And once again, this is a long-term issue where, as a society and as a government, we just live beyond our means, and no government seems to want to bring that back under control. The Liberals didn't. They had their opportunity for many years and they didn't do it. And now it's the same with the current government. The other thing, of course, is the economy will grow. So the budget figures show that, and I'll talk about the economy in a moment. But growth is an interesting area. We talk about GDP, gross domestic product, and that grows. Governments want that to grow. That's all well and good, but you need it to grow in such a way that as a nation, our standard of living increases. But what you'll see from the government's figures is that the growth is slowing, but the population growth is exploding. So what in fact is happening is, because we're bringing in such a high level of immigration, that's actually propping up the economy. I would literally, and this is the expression I've used with friends for years, Australia is a population Ponzi scheme. We bring in immigrants to prop everything up, to prop up our GDP, prop up our economy. And that to me is, an appalling way, an appallingly lazy way to run an economic system. But once again, we'll touch more on that issue in a moment. But and then, of course, there's forecasting. Once again, I feel sorry for the Treasury officials that have to come up with these things where they make forecasts for the year ahead, because someone's going to hold you to them. And the Bible makes it very clear that you shouldn't listen to people about forecasts, because no one knows the future, only God does. And a lot of these forecasts, they're built on assumptions. And global events can change that very quickly. If we look at things like the war in Ukraine, I try and follow that reasonably closely, because the media is a bit quieter on it these days, in the sense that people have moved on personally from it. But the reality is there's a big troop build up there, and if that does get worse as it gets out of control, that could be highly inflationary. So. And of course, it'd be devastating if it's already a human tragedy as it is. It'd be devastating if that expands into a broader war. And so once again, the ramifications of these things are unpredictable, and we don't know the future. So that's just sort of some initial thoughts on the budget. Let me just move into some of the more specific areas. The first one, and this is a helpful announcement on the cost of living, in particular energy costs. The government has announced they're going to give basically an energy rebate. This will go directly through the retailers to the relevant people. So it's not like a cash handout that you spend on energy. It will be paid. It'll be given to you potentially directly through your energy retailer. That's of course if you qualify, and there's a range of people for that. And it's a large number. We're talking about millions of Australians here, people on pensions, various government payments like family tax benefit A and B. There's a very large number of people that qualify. And you get a $500 tax rebate on your energy bill. So there's no question that helps. There's also $650 for small businesses that qualify. But once again, you've got to remember that doesn't actually deal with the heart of the issue, which is why our energy bill is going up in the first place. And so that to me is the real issue. The other thing here is they announced a $5 billion increase in job seeker. So, colloquially, we call that the dole. It equates to essentially $40 per fortnight, or less than $3 a day. I think when I did the maths, it was about $280 or something per day, which, once again, it's helpful. But if you consider the cost of living over the last 12 months, it's really just playing catch up. I think there's a few bigger issues here. I would personally support a higher job seeker if we also got the wrong people off it in the first place. So we want to provide, in my view, government should provide genuine help to people who genuinely need it, but we need to try and move people off so they don't become welfare dependents for life. I think there's a real risk you end up with generational poverty through these kind of things. So we want to help people move off it as quick as they can and just use it as a genuine, source of helping them. But to me, it's, as I say, the problem with it is it's really just playing catch up. Another one that was announced is rental assistance. That they've increased that by 15%. But if you look, once again, if you look what's happened in Australia over the last 12 months, and look, there's slightly different figures if you look at apartments versus houses, is rents are up nationally over 11% already. And obviously it depends on what part of Australia you live in. But essentially, it hasn't solved any of the long-term issues. But the ridiculousness of it is you've got this counter pressure. So, okay, rent assistance has gone up, but you're bringing so many immigrants into Australia. I think this year it's going to be a net migration of 400,000 people. where do you house all these people? Of course, it's going to drive up rents. And my concern is you're actually going to have homelessness issue. You know, I don't think of it as, I think of that as a problem you see in America, not a problem you see in Australia. I mean, Australia does genuinely have homeless. I used to go around and feed them with St. Vincent de Paul many years ago. But the reality is it doesn't need to be this way. We just don't need to be doing this. Yet we're turbocharging immigration, which is only going to put more pressure on rent. So I think it really is quite appalling in my view. The other thing is the pharmaceutical benefit scheme changes. Basically, they're allowing people to buy twice as much on the one script. Basically, it's a general saving for patients up to about $180 a year per subsidised prescription. So generally beneficial. So as you can see from a lot of these measures, they're all aimed at people who are struggling. So they're more at that end of the social, at the financial end where, you know, cash flow is tight already. So in that sense, as I say, I think they're beneficial, but just not sustainable long term. One thing that also a lot of people particularly don't realise it's going to happen to them this year is that under the previous government, we had a thing called the middle and low income tax offset. And you only see this really when you do your tax return. If you've ever looked at your tax return, one of the statements, there's a line item you'll see on the first or second page that says middle and low income tax offset. And that's $1,500. Now that was due to expire, and it did expire in June last year. So that was the last time people got it. So this year is the first year, then they're going to actually see it disappear. So if they're thinking they were going to get a bigger tax refund this year, they're going to be disappointed. Most people, and this is millions of people, are going to see their tax refund drop by about $1,500. So they haven't extended that. Now, once again, that was already built in. So that was not something new from the budget, but it's just to say people don't realise that their tax return this year isn't going to be as full as what they're used to in previous years. The other thing that, this is something that the Liberal Party brought in a couple of years ago, I think Malcolm Turnbull was the Prime Minister at the time, was tax cuts. There were 3 stages, and stage 3 is due to come out in July next year, and all of those have been maintained. So they haven't changed those. Whether they change it next year before they actually come into play is anybody's guess. But certainly those tax cuts really, they mainly help with what we call bracket creep. You know, if you think about people's wages going up every year, your wage eventually hits the next tax bracket. So they're not that big a deal in the sense, do they help? Yes, they do, but they're not as big a deal as people think they are because of bracket creep. The other thing that was a positive is they've raised the threshold where Medicare levy cuts in. So that's good once again for people at the more struggling end. And they're also trying to incentivise GPs to bulk bill. So increase that for as many people as possible to obviously keep the cost of your healthcare down. So as you can see, they've targeted really 3 areas: your energy costs, the housing with rental assistance, and of course healthcare. So they're the 3 big areas. And when you think about it, to be fair, they are very important areas of people's finances. And so in that sense, you'd say it's a positive. But as I say, the negative of it, and once again, I'll probably be critical of who, irrespective of who is in power, is we need long-term things. We need things that are going to actually bring those things down over the long term, rather than band-aid solutions each year. That's just not going to cut it. One last thing they did say is they were going to they've announced low-cost loans so people can make energy upgrades to their homes, i.e. you can install solar and so forth using a low-cost loan. So that may be good for many people if you're trying to bring your energy costs down. Now, if you jump to the economy, as I mentioned, the forecasts show that the economy is going to slow. So Australia's been very blessed. We've had very high growth relative to most of the world, but that is going to slow next year down to 1.5%. And that seems to be the way things are definitely going. If you think about what the Reserve Bank is doing as it puts up rates, the cost of living rises for a huge number of people, those with mortgages, and therefore they can consume less, and therefore the economy contracts. If we're all spending less, the economy will contract. And you're going to see that. As I say, that figure would be even lower if you stripped out immigration. You know, immigration is what's propping up the Australian economy. Some people are even forecasting recession, and we may well go into recession early next year, I would say. I think that will also be, certainly consumer sentiment is quite negative at the moment. And that may well be the case depending on world events as they transpire over the rest of the year. And certainly the US itself looks like it's almost guaranteed to go into recession. So certainly a possibility, and Australia will be affected by that sentiment. Unemployment, look, once again, this is where I think Australia is, let's be honest, we're very blessed. Unemployment is very low. I don't actually like the way they calculate unemployment. I actually don't look at the official figures. I look at, there's an organisation called Roy Morgan, and they put out alternative figures, and those figures to me are far more accurate. The reason why I say that is the way unemployment is calculated in Australia. If you work just 1 hour a week, then you're deemed to be employed. Now, if you work just 1 hour a week, that's not going to cover your bills. So yes, you're employed because you've been paid for an hour, but it's hardly reflective of your true situation. Whereas Roy Morgan used a different measure, the way they calculate it, and therefore the figure is considerably higher. They also look at what we call underemployment as well. Actually, and the government also has its own official underemployment figures as well. The good news, and I'm a bit skeptical about this one, is that inflation, so CPI, which stands for Consumer Price Index, is to fall from 6% to 3% next year. So that's good news. As I say, I'm a bit skeptical of that. I think, once again, these things are hard to forecast. If you look at the figures that have come out in the last few months, looks like inflation is still a bit sticky. It's staying high. So even though we've had these significant interest rate increases, inflation is only just starting to tick down. It's still pretty high. So I'm a bit, a bit skeptical that they'll get it down as quick as they hope, and therefore we may still see a few more rate rises. The other one, and this is a positive, but so long as it doesn't get out of control, and that is wage growth is expected to rise to about 4% next year. But what's important here is they're expecting to actually exceed inflation. Okay, which, when, in other words, what we call real wages increase. I'll believe it when I see it, but essentially, when you think about it, the last 12, 18 months, most people, okay, their wages may have gone up a little bit, but nothing like inflation. And so, in other words, everyone has become a little bit poorer over the last 12 months as wages haven't kept up with inflation. So the government's actually tipping that next year wages will exceed inflation. That's a positive, but whether it turns out that way is yet to be seen. And of course, it's going to depend on what happens to the actual inflation rate as well. So it's going to be interesting. I think we're heading into an interesting 12 months. Housing. So I mentioned before, the government has a range of schemes here. Firstly, rent assistance. I mentioned that before. They want to increase that by 15%. There's a thing called the Home Buyer Guarantee Scheme, and that was designed to help people buy their own home and get in with a much lower deposit. Normally, if you go to a bank, you need between 5 and 20% as a minimum deposit. Under this, it would come down to as low as 2% and up to 5% that you could put in as a deposit, and the government would essentially guarantee the loan. So rather than you needing what's called lender's mortgage insurance, which is very expensive, you wouldn't need that because essentially the government is guaranteeing the loan. So what they've done here is they've expanded the number of people that qualify. They haven't expanded the number of spots. So in other words, the same number of guarantees are being offered, but not. So that hasn't been expanded, but just more people have it available. So it's somewhat of a misleading in the sense that it's not going to necessarily help that many more people. As I say, my massive gripe here is that we're turbocharging immigration. Now, by the way, as a general rule, I'm pro-immigration. Australia's an immigrant country. I'm married to an immigrant. And I think it's a net positive as a general rule. However, you've got to remember you need infrastructure to keep up with immigration. And we're not, I mean, I always think, okay, if you're going to bring 400,000 people into Australia over 12 months, are you creating enough hospitals to look after those 400,000 people if, when things happen in their health? And the answer is, of course not. We're not building nearly that quickly. The other thing is, it's no secret that over the last 12 months, hundreds, if not thousands, of construction companies have gone broke. because the cost of materials has gone up dramatically and builders have got themselves into hot water. So that's a problem in itself. And the thing, and I saw an article actually in today's paper, they were talking about negative gearing, but they haven't announced that they were going to remove that. And I think that we need to, my philosophical position on this is that housing is not an item of investment speculation. Housing is a place to live. And to me, at a society level, we want to find a place where everyone can live and live affordably. What we're doing is we've turned it into a speculative investment, and people borrowing their money in their super fund to buy houses and investment properties and all this sort of stuff. And it's made housing this very expensive thing that it doesn't need to be. And so I'm very critical in that regard. The other thing they announced was what's called build to rent. And they're basically increasing the tax deductions available to developers to encourage more development. So that's a positive. Does it make a huge difference? Time will tell. And of course, additional funding to the organisation is about to change its name to Housing Australia. It's a government body to develop more social housing. So once again, these are all positives, but I think Labor announced they wanted to build 1 million houses by 2030, I think it is. But if you think about, we're bringing 1.5 million people over the next 5 years. We're just not keeping up. So I think that once again, we need to totally reevaluate our housing policy to make it fairer for everyone. If we jump to super, really there were minimal changes here. One that won't really affect most people is that anyone who's got more than $3 million in their super fund is just going to have a higher tax rate. And that tax rate only applies on the amounts they have above 3 million, not amounts below. So it's a bit of a non-event because, as I say, it's going to affect very few people. One thing that I do think is actually a positive, it will affect businesses, some would say negatively, but is that your super must be paid at the same time as you get paid your salary. Now, the reason why I'm in favour of that is what I've witnessed over the years is many small businesses, they delay paying their staff with their super because legally at the moment you only have to pay it quarterly. And what happens is they may delay it because their business is having tough cash flow issues. And as a result, they end up missing it, and then they keep delaying it, and then after a year, business folds, you lose your job, and you miss out on all that super. So I like the idea that they're paying it as you go, and that way, the business just has to manage its cash flow better. And if the business is in trouble, then they have to lay people off, perhaps sooner than they would have. But maybe it'll actually help them to manage their finances better in general. But I think it's better for the average Aussie who's getting paid their super. The other thing is the superannuation guarantee, which is currently 10.5%. That's the amount that your employer has to pay you. So if you earn 100 grand, they have to pay 10,500. That goes up in July to 11%. It's eventually going to go to 12% and stop there. But at the moment, it's currently 11%. It will be 11% from 1st of July this year. Another thing called the transfer balance cap has just been indexed from 1.7 to 1.9 million. But once again, that won't affect the majority of Aussies. So very minimal changes there, which in one sense I'm positive about. I think they need to really limit how much they fiddle with super, because it's a great system that we have. And I think it's a real turn off to people if it's constantly changing. You can't trust the system if it's constantly being tampered with. So in that sense, positive, but overall very minimal changes. But the real question with this is, with the budget, is will these policies stoke inflation? And I think in one sense I was relieved, even though I think, I probably summarised the budget by saying it was somewhat of a nothing burger. There was nothing too dramatic in it. Is it good long term? I don't think so. But once again, I'm sceptical that the other side would bring much more to it that would be long term either. Will these things stoke inflation? Certainly, they're building in higher levels of spending over time, so that's inflationary. But overall, I didn't think there was anything dramatic and we're going to see a big spike in inflation. So I think the Reserve Bank would be relieved from that. That doesn't mean rates won't go up a bit further, but certainly I think they haven't done anything to stoke it particularly badly. What are the long-term implications though? And this is once again general comments about the budget overall and the budget. And as I say, I think both the major parties fall into this category. We've got the problem where we live in a society now whenever there's a problem, and this is where the church has a massive opportunity, by the way. We live in a society now that basically says, government, solve my problem. There's a societal issue of some sort, and we ask the government to fix it. And so if you're a politician, you've got this never-ending demand on you by media and by the general populace for more and more services, more and more benefits, etc. And so the end result of that is we're witnessing the need for taxes to rise to cover the cost of all of this. And what that does is it makes everything more expensive, but it crowds out the private sector, which reduces your prosperity over time. But it's the inevitable outcome of a society that's constantly demanding more and more from government. I would like to see government shrink dramatically, but I can't see that on the horizon at any time soon. The other thing I'd like to see, and I honestly think it's a national shame that housing in such a large country as Australia is just so expensive. It is extraordinarily expensive whether to rent or buy. I mean, if you think about, as I mentioned, rents are up well over 11% over the last 12 months. But if you look at mortgages, if you have a standard variable home loan and you're paying principal and interest, your mortgage repayments have gone up over 50% in the last 12 months, courtesy of the Reserve Bank. Now, that's the inevitable outcome of inflation, but that's also driven by government policies that led to the inflation in the first place. So we need genuine policies that are going to get the cost of housing down, not a myriad of band-aids that constantly just keep it propped up. So we need to ultimately, if we want to see a prosperous Australia and a nation that was enormously prosperous over the last 100 years, we need to lower the size of government so that we can get more prosperity and more freedom. And I think that is that's critical longer term for the nation. And the other concern I have is more what I call generation inequity. Without wanting to pick on the baby boomers too much, but they've had it amazingly good over their lifetimes. If you think about the cost of buying a house 30, 40 years ago, you could buy a house pretty much on one income and 3 times income. To buy a house now in many parts of Australia, it takes 2 incomes and it takes about 6 times income when you look at the Reserve Bank figures. So I think we've created this generation inequity, which is very unfair on younger people because they're expected to pay for everyone's retirements and Centrelink, but they're also expected to pay this huge amount for houses. So I think it's a very unfair system. And probably my bigger concern though, is that we're creating a working poor. So we've got people, we've got low unemployment and we've got people with jobs, but we're driving the cost of living up so much and sucking the prosperity out of the economy that you can have all these people. Yeah, they have jobs and they're working full time and often working 2 jobs, but they're what I call the working poor. They're just struggling. They're only just getting by, and I think that's a real tragedy. And it's due to government mismanagement over a long period of time. And that's not something just from this budget. It's been going on for years and years. And I think that's very unfair and very sad. So now I want to jump into, okay, well, that's all well and good, Alex. That's a bit of an overview, and some might say a little depressing too. But I think what I want to focus on is, okay, what do we need to do going forward? What's the next 12 months look like, and how do I manage money well? The first thing I want to encourage you to do is to build margin into your life. It's no surprise that we are heading into tougher times. We have a business cycle, we go through good periods and bad periods. We're going to a tougher period. I would strongly encourage you to do 2 things. One is you want to have a budget and where you build a surplus. So the idea of a budget is simply how much money is coming in versus how much is going out. And you need to build a surplus into that so that you can get ahead. The other thing is build reserves. So have an emergency fund. We never know if we're going to lose our job, or maybe you've got your own business and your revenue falls. And I know that's a concern for a lot of small business people at the moment. Revenue is starting to slide. So you want to have emergency funds to drive that through. So you want to build margin. And along that lines, I always encourage people to try and save 10% of their net income, but I'll touch up more on that in a moment. The second thing is you want to get more control over your cash. So this is taking that first step and taking it further. I like what's often referred to as a bucket approach to managing cash. Some of you may have heard of this concept before. In fact, under the old school approach, where we were very much a cash-based economy historically, is the old envelope style, where you put different expenses in different envelopes to try and learn how to control your money. With this bucket approach, I would say you basically apply the same logic, but you have different accounts for different things. The first principle is you always have an emergency fund. And I say you need to have somewhere between 3 to 6 months worth of living expenses in your emergency bucket, i.e. that's your rainy day fund. Then money for your day-to-day living expenses, your bills, your mortgage, your rent, etc. Have an account specifically for that. And then one for your long-term savings goals. And a concept here, which I'll talk about more in a moment, is automating this process. So for example, your salary may go into one bucket, like straight into your living expenses bucket. And then what I do is set up an automatic direct debit so that the next day after you get paid, that money, a lot of it is swept across into your savings bucket. So in other words, you're forcing yourself to save through automation. You're not doing this, you don't have to think about it. You're automating the process to help you manage the cash. Because ultimately what we want to try and do here, and actually let me make a statement, and that statement is that one of the keys to long-term financial success is how you behave with money, okay? How you behave with money will be a long-term driver of your success. And so this bucket-based approach is about helping put into practice good behaviors with money so that you handle your cash more effectively. And one of those is this concept here of how you actually spend your money. So, let's assume you earn a salary, you get paid, or maybe you get a bit of income from Centrelink or from other sources, investment income, etc. What you do with that income is critical. Now, obviously, we've all got expenses to pay. No surprise there. Many of us also have liabilities. We've got our mortgage, etc. But the one that is often overlooked is putting your money into assets that generate more income. You can see the way the arrows work here. You get your income. Sure, you got to pay expenses. Yes, you got to pay your liabilities, but you've also got to buy assets with your income. And this is where the whole savings issue comes in. You want to save, as I say, at least 10% of your income so you can buy income producing assets. So that could be shares, could be property, could be any asset that produces an income. And of course, that feeds back into your income, and therefore your income grows over time, which means you can pay down your liabilities quicker and so forth. But this is about just thinking carefully about how you use your money, okay? Yes, you got to pay expenses. Yes, you got to pay liabilities, but you also need to pay yourself by buying income producing assets over time. The next area is debt. And one of the big changes, I should have put a graph up here just to show you, but over the last 30 years, you've had interest rates drop from 18% on a home loan. So those of you who had a home loan in 1990 will remember this, 18%. And then they came down to the start of 2022, you could have got your home loan around 2%. An unbelievable drop. So over 30 years, interest rates came down, 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 down. And to be honest, I was staggered they ever got that low. But what's happened is in the last 10 months is you've had the fastest, or last 12 months, you've had the fastest interest rate rise in history. And so my argument to you is that you've witnessed the end of cheap money. So the days of cheap money that we've been used to over the particularly last 10 years, pretty much ever since the global financial crisis in 2008, that era has now ended, and money is going to be more expensive. So interest rates, there are some economists saying that if Australia goes into recession, interest rates will fall, and that may well happen, but I don't think they're ever going to go back to the 2% that you saw. You saw 12 months ago. I think that era is gone, and so there's no more cheap money. I'd really also encourage you to avoid debt as much as possible, given where we are in the cycle. Do you really need it? Just think very carefully, because rates, as I say, we don't know how much further they've got to go. You can listen to all the commentators you want, but at the end of the day, no one knows. And as I say, we are at the end of cheap money, that era. Another comment here is to look at refinancing your debt. at the moment, despite the rate rises, the mortgage market is quite competitive, and many banks have been offering what they call cashbacks, where they give you $3,000 or $4,000 for refinancing your home loan. So if your home loan is coming close to the end of its fixed period, you could, or it's already variable, look at refinancing that loan, which normally incurs close to $1,000 worth of costs because you've got discharge fees for your old loan, application fees for your new loan, etc. Many banks have cashback, so they'll cover those costs. But the point I'm trying to make here is very simple. We want to get the cost of your debt down as low as we possibly can. If you can get the cost of it down, then you can throw more money against it. You do your budget and pay down as much of your debt as quick as you can. Because as I say, we don't know where rates are going to end up. So I want you just to be as intentional as you can at getting your debt down. One message, and any of you who've known me for a long time, I always say to people, avoid credit cards like the plague. There's something weird psychologically about them that makes you spend more money. There's just a massive temptation to consume more than you otherwise would have. And so I encourage you to avoid credit cards in their entirety and just use debit cards. You can still do all the online transactions that you need to do. Then there's the concept of renting versus buying. So my philosophical position here is that over the long term, buying makes sense, right? Because by the time you get to retirement, by the time you get to 65 plus, it would be lovely to own your own home, to not have to pay rent and not have to pay a mortgage. So I think conceptually, buying is a good thing. However, there are periods when renting can be a lot cheaper than buying. And one thing over the last few years, because rates have come down so much, buying has often been advantageous to renting. But that has totally flipped on its head over the last 12 months. And even though renting is going up, it's not going up anywhere near the rate that mortgages have. Rents are up 11% on average. Mortgages are up 50% on average over the last 12 months. Don't be afraid to rent. As I say, it's not a good renting environment at the moment. Vacancy rates are horribly low. There's all those issues. But having a mortgage at the moment isn't great either. And we don't know where mortgage rates are going to end up. And so just be really cautious around debt. The Bible talks a lot about debt and particularly the risk that you enter into slavery. And my concern is that many, many Australians now, millions, have entered into a mild form of slavery where basically, they live in their nice house, but they've got a massive mortgage that they can barely afford. And I think that's a great tragedy. And from a Christian perspective, it's really bad because, we want to live generously. We want to be able to help people. And if you're enslaved to debt, that makes it very, very difficult to do. Next thing, prepare for opportunity. Tough times bring about opportunity. And if we do go into recession, which I think is increasingly looking likely, what you're going to witness is the downturn in asset prices. Now, this has already started already. So properties come off over the last 12 months. It has ticked up a little bit in Australia. If you're talking about rental investment property, like as in residential, it's gone up a little bit in the last 2 to 3 months. But over the last 12 months, housing's off about 10, 15%. And I suspect that if mortgage rates keep rising, you'll start to see it dip down again towards the end of the year, particularly also if unemployment picks up. As I mentioned at the start, the Bible actually talks a lot more about money than we often realize. And there's a fabulous passage in Ecclesiastes 11 verse 2, where it says, invest in 7 ventures, yes, in 8, because you do not know what disaster may come upon the land. In other words, don't put all your eggs in one basket, diversify your money, because it will make a big difference in terms of how you manage your capital and protecting your capital. The classic mistake I've seen as a planner over the years when people have come to me is they've often put all their eggs into one property or one investment, and then they find it doesn't perform the way they were told it would perform. So just diversify your money. Of course, to actually invest in the first place, you need to save money. So as I mentioned earlier slides, try and save at least 10% of your net income. That way you've got money to invest. So because, from that cash flow point of view, you got to pay your expenses, you got to pay your you've got to pay your liabilities, but ultimately you want to invest money in assets that produce income. So in fact, philosophically, from an investment point of view, to be a successful investor, you want to create a growing income stream for yourself. So the 2 best assets for that ultimately are shares and real estate, because ultimately the income streams from those assets rise over time. And the other thing I say to people is try and get into the habit of investing monthly. There's lots of strategies. Many of you are doing this by default through your super fund, a strategy called dollar cost averaging, where you're adding in a small amount every month. But just get into this habit of investing on a monthly basis to grow your wealth over time. And then prepare for, as I mentioned, once again, still on the investment theme, invest in things that multiply. Now, I've put up two very obviously well-known companies. These are not investment recommendations, by the way. They're merely to illustrate, to make a point about investing in things that multiply. Okay, if you look at why McDonald's is successful, McDonald's is successful because it operates a fabulous system called franchising. Now, in Australia, there's lots of franchises. McDonald's, Subway, Harvey Norman, all those companies are franchise models. And basically, it's where you use other people's capital to grow your business. I think McDonald's has more than 36,000 stores around the world, which would be, Ray Kroc, who set it up. He's obviously long gone now, but there's no way that one person could ever set up a business like that in their lifetime, let alone multiple lifetimes. But franchising allows you to do it through that multiplier model where you're using other people's capital. Then you've got something like Facebook. Once again, as I mentioned, none of these are recommendations, but it's more that you understand the concept of multiplication here. Facebook is basically a new form of word of mouth on steroids, effectively. So it's a great multiplier model. It's gone from having no one on the platform, 20 years ago didn't exist, to now having 1.5 or 2 billion people on it. So just think conceptually, when I'm buying something, is this something that's likely to grow and multiply over time? So a very important way, I think, to think about it. I mentioned before we talked about the cash flow issue is to try and automate your finances. Look, most of you are in jobs that don't involve money, other than, of course, getting paid. But money is not something that you're thinking about when you go to work during the day. You're going off to do a particular job. And so I encourage people to think about how you can automate your finances. So this could be automating your savings. So as I mentioned before, make sure you get paid and you pay yourself first through long-term saving. The moment after you get your income, automate it so that money gets swept out and put into another account. You can automate, obviously, your bill paying to make sure you don't pay bills, don't default on any of those. Automate some of your giving. Only disclaimer I put with giving is, to me, giving should be Holy Spirit led. So yes, you should have your fixed giving, but you should also still be open to, God's leading. If He wants you to increase your giving or give to new organizations, you've still got to be open to those kind of things. But the point here is what we want to do is automate. As I mentioned before, your key to long-term success is how you behave with money. And therefore, there's a need to automate your finances, make it easy for yourself to behave well with money. So automate it. And lastly, point 6, who can you help? We are heading into more challenging waters. Things are getting tougher for Aussies. So live open-handedly. As I say, it's not our money, it's God's money. And I should live with an open hand. How can I help those around me in my communities, in my church, and people who are in need around us? I believe it's the church's responsibility to help the poor, not the government. All these handouts and all these things are things that have grown since social security was invented, and society's only gotten worse since then. Hasn't improved things. I actually think it's the job of the church to step up and fulfill this need, and also to help rebuild our society in ways that are functional. And of course, my other comment here is to live for eternity. Have that eternal focus with your money. Life is breathtakingly quick. And I want you to hear the words, well done, good and faithful servant, but also to sow into things that are going to last. Build God's kingdom. That should be our focus. Yes, there's lots of good things about living in Australia, and we're blessed in many ways, but we need to have that eternal focus with our lives and how we use our money. If you need help from me, more than happy to help you. We try and help people as much as we can. So people can reach out to us. There's lots of free resources on our website. So depending on how you heard about this webinar, you can go to wealthwithpurpose.com, and on there's truckloads of things, free ebooks. There's a thing, our toolkit, which is like a budget planner and debt schedule and a range of things. There's podcasts, there's webinars. If you sign up to our newsletter, you basically be informed of all of these things. But yeah, heaps of information there for you to rely on. The other thing is if you do need individual help and you'd like to have a chat to someone, we have a financial planning arm, works under a different brand called Livingston Wealth Management. We can have an initial consultation where we talk about your goals, obviously where you're at, what some of the challenges are, what some of your opportunities are, and what your options are. So if you're interested in that, once again, you go to the Wealth with Purpose website and you can just go to our financial planning page, and that will direct you into where you can get some more help there. So thanks for being part of today. Greg, I'll hand over to you. And of course, we can have some Q&A as well for people who want to ask any more.
Thank you, Alex. I'm not sure how long we'll have for Q&A, but hand back the screen. I was most impressed, Alex, really with the presentation, particularly from a biblical perspective. I think we all have to be good stewards of our own wealth and what have you. But one of the issues that I've always looked at is that whatever we do, we should be doing it to glorify God. So it is 8 o'clock, Alex. What I might do is ask people to write in with any questions, and I'm just going to close in a quick word of prayer, if I may, please, Alex, and then
yeah, sure,
and then we'll go from there. I think because one of the problems we have is that we want to make sure that as I said, everything that we do is in the name of our Lord. So let's just bow our heads quickly. Lord God, Heavenly Father, thank you so much for the wisdom that Alex has given us, and I know that what he says is to glorify you. We thank you that you've enabled us to be able to feed our families, but also to help us to make sure that we can feed the poor, those less fortunate than ourselves. The budget is biblical, Lord. It tells us we've got to be good stewards of our money, wealth. But Lord, Heavenly Father, whatever we do, can you help us to make sure that it's to glorify you? And we do thank you in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen. Thank you very much, Alex. Everybody, thank you. This is being recorded. What I will do is if you have any questions, email me and I'll pass it on to Alex personally, because some of your questions may well be personal. And in that regard, you won't get, you won't be embarrassed. I'm sure Alex will take the opportunity to answer them. So God bless you all. Thank you very much. There is another webinar coming, but I do appreciate the godly support you give me, and in particular for the presentation that Alex said. God bless, and I look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. God bless everybody. Thank you, Alex.
My pleasure. Thanks, Greg. Cheers.
Bye-bye.